Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where we are delighted, I'm Adam Posen, the president, and we are delighted to have a full house, a very high-level, high-quality full house for an extremely high-quality discussion today. As all of you are aware, we are proud to have with us Anat Admati and Martin Hellwig, two absolutely world-class academics who, in the past year, have managed to write an astonishingly well-written and extremely important book, The Banker's New Clothes. And thanks to their intervention and that of our friend Simon Johnson, we are able to hold their rollout here in Washington for this book and to have an outstanding group of people to discuss it and get the discussion going. So thank you all for joining us for this. Just by way of introduction, Professor Admati is, of course, the George G.C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at Stanford. She's been at Stanford for, I believe, more than 20 years, is a fellow of the Econometric Society, has an incredibly distinguished publication record, and has been, I won't put words in her mouth, perhaps not radicalized, but at least activated in the last couple of years by the financial crisis, and has crossed over to our side of the street, as it were, and we're delighted to welcome her here. Her co-author is the possibly even more distinguished, if possible, Martin Hellwig from Germany, head of the Max Planck Institute for Collective Goods. He's had an incredible academic career. Many of us know him. He comes to the Bellagio Group, which is a group of international finance scholars and officials, and he starts every intervention with, well, I'm not a macroeconomist, but, and then he proceeds to shred the lack of micro foundations and everything else we're doing. And he too has now crossed the street to think tank land, at least briefly. I will not besmirch the Max Planck Institute by calling it a think tank, more as a collective good. And they two together are going to be presenting their exciting book, The Banker's New Clothes. I'm not going to do any more to preview it, just to say that it has been all the rage in the central banking and supervision circles, and occasionally inducing rage in central banking and supervision circles. The format is going to be that Anat and Martin together are going to present, and they will take roughly 30 minutes. If they're at all rough on it, I will be rough on them. And then we have three distinguished discussants to lead it off. Speaking first will be our own Morris Goldstein, senior fellow here at the Institute, and arguably the intellectual father of the first global banking standard, and of course a noted, witty, and insightful, and opinionated commenter on these issues. And so Morris will speak briefly, and that will be followed by David Schra, who is regulatory counsel at the Institute of International Finance. We're very grateful to David and the IIF for coming and engaging in a full, open, and intellectual spirit on this. And David, of course, has an extensive background in the private sector, working with JP Morgan, working with Euroclear, developing various standards in the international sphere, and is perfectly poised to give a both industry but also a realistic response to the book. And then finally, it's my pleasure as well to introduce my old friend Peter Fisher of BlackRock, who I knew when I was a first-year economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and he was the dashing young star who spent all his life in Basel, which admittedly seemed a little less dashing, but was also the man with the keys to the gold vault at the New York Fed. Peter has also, of course, gone on to be Undersecretary of the Treasury for Domestic Affairs in the Bush administration, and now is part of the management committee of BlackRock, and I'm proud to say recently joined the board of the Peterson Institute, and so we're delighted to have him on the stage. So Barney Frank made fun of me the other day for saying without further ado, so I don't say that anymore. Without delay, I turn to Professor Admati and then Professor Hellwig. Thank you very much.
First of all, I want to thank a number of people, and I won't want to take too much of my own time to do that. I don't know if Simon's already here, but it was Simon's first brought up the idea of doing this event, so whether he's here or not, I'm going to find a way to tell him that, and he knows that I'm very grateful for him to him for that and for many other things that he's been doing in the space. We don't always say precisely the same things, but he's been very helpful to me in many ways. And I'm grateful to Adam for Posen and the Peterson Institute for hosting this, and also for being a place where I've exchanged a lot of ideas with people in the space about financial stability. That's an issue that I've taken on in the last few years, and so Peterson has been the home for a group of us, including a discussion that focused on this book that was essentially a focus group about the book that was really, really helpful to us in sort of figuring out how to do this book. There are a number of other people in the room who've been helpful, and I just won't go through it, you know who you are, but I'm also thankful for all of you who just came to engage, the three panelists in particular, who made time to come and be here, because we wrote this book in order to engage, and that's why this is very special, that this is what we're doing today, because it's exactly what we want to do. So I want to take some time, and I'm the first, so it's Martin who's going to have to be tough on me if I take too long. Usually I have to be dragged out of opportunities of this sort, as some of you know. So we want to structure this as a sort of bad news, good news, kind of bad news structure. So I'm going to start with some bad news, then I'm going to have some good news, and then I'm going to kind of allude to some other bad news, and then Martin's going to take that, so I can finish off on good news. So what's the bad news? The bad news is that we have a very grim assessment of what's going on with financial reformers with the banking system. We believe that it is a very dangerous system, that it's not, that financial reform has really failed to improve it significantly, and that it is vulnerable and distorted and prone to having severe governance problems, and all kinds of issues pervade it. There are scandals every day. I'm not going to go into any of that, but something is not quite right and not quite healthy with this system. Actually, multiple things are not quite right with this system. So what's going to happen, what might happen, whether there is this sort of, will there be another crisis? They tell you, no more crisis, no more bailout, we fixed it all, go back to sleep. Then other people say, oh, crisis will happen, it's something that happens every 5 to 7 years, can't do anything about it, can't predict them, stuff happens, earthquakes happen, natural disasters, that analogy. So there are all kinds of narratives around. This book is a lot about narratives and what people say. So the bottom line on crisis and bailouts and all of that is likely there will be another crisis. And if financial institutions get into trouble, we will face a stark choice. We are trying to do resolution mechanisms. They might or might not be triggered or be useful. But in any case, it's not going to be fun. That's quite clear, should this system crack. So, but I want to say more than that, because even without a crisis, you can prevent a crisis. You can keep feeding the system. It can plug along. It's not a healthy system every day. Every day it's a distorted system, because every day banks that are not healthy are not making the right loans, maybe making bad loans, maybe keeping loans on their books that they shouldn't, doing all kinds of distorted things, not making good decisions, and not serving the economy as well as they can. So we have a system that is able and really critical for economic growth, and yet it's not healthy. Something's wrong with it. Now, now comes the good news. The good news is it doesn't have to be like that. It does not have to be like that. You can sort of say, well, too bad, to have growth, to have a system, a thriving system, we need to have it that way. That's false, that's wrong. The system does not have to be like that just because it is like that, or it's evolved like that, or we haven't managed to fix it. It can change. That's basically our good news, and not only our good news, but we say how as well, or at least how to move to something better than what we have now. Now, in order to do that, you first have to diagnose the problem, and then you have to figure out what to do. So the system is very, very fragile. Fragile meaning, you touch it, it can crack. It's a set of dominoes standing one to another, whatever image you want to have about it. It's very fragile. Does it have to be so fragile? So here comes the answer. It does not have to be that fragile. It can be a lot safer. And will we have to pay a big price for that? The answer is no. So what we are told about that trade-off issue, you have to choose between growth and safety of banks, is just a false trade-off and false comparison. It's not right. We can have a better system. Now, what makes the system fragile? First of all and foremost, our diagnosis is the system is fragile because there is too much indebtedness throughout this system. There is too much reliance on debt. Pure and simple. Now, obviously, banks borrow. Part of their business is to borrow, but it does not follow that they have to be as highly leveraged, highly indebted as they are. Banks are the most highly indebted entities in the economy by far. No healthy corporation maintains itself with this thin a sliver, especially not corporations that we need to be safe, that are best at what they do when they're safe. So we need to have a safe, stable banking system. Then this system and the economy will thrive together. How do we make it safer? We make sure that there isn't as much indebtedness in this system. We need to do that because it won't happen on its own. This is not a system where the markets are working. Why aren't they working? They're not working because the key to sort of understanding this, and we explain this in the book, is really to start with borrowing, with the experience of heavy borrowers. Heavy borrowers, people who are highly indebted, have behaviors and preferences that are different from people who just, I mean corporations, because it's corporations that don't have to borrow in order to invest. They start having different feelings about how they continue to fund. Now, banks start with the borrowing, and therefore they are in what we call a debt overhang situation from off the bat. And debt overhang situation is a situation where you already have that in place. And at that point, you become a bit biased towards more borrowing and a bit biased towards more risk in general because of a classic conflict of interest between creditors and borrowers. The borrower always slightly prefer to go on the edge because part of the downside is borne by the creditor. So if you take that situation, you jack it up to the kinds of indebtedness that banks have gotten themselves into. So in other words, leverage at these rates is addictive. And you add into this mix a safety net. You add into the mix a situation in which the distress, default, insolvency of banks has collateral damage for the economy. We can't let it happen. If they go on hard times, they stop lending, runs happen, bad things happen. As a result, for stability, we step in, governments step in. We don't blame governments for stepping in and doing what needs to be done for the economy. No problem there. The question is, can we maintain this system farther away from that point? And here, the guarantees are doing something completely counterproductive, which is they make it easier and possible to borrow under favorable terms. That ends up creating a subsidy for borrowing and not for other kinds of funding, like equity. So the hated word in banking is equity, and this is where we go without any shame. The mantra in banking is anything but equity, and our mantra is only equity. Only equity. Because anything other than equity funding, pure and simple residual claimants that bear the upside and the downside, anything else is subject to already that overhang on the part of the decision makers. So there are lots of things that might absorb losses, but equity is the gold standard. And the question is equity expensive? There is where a whole string of claims would come in, but the answer is, well, yes, to the banks, but it's not expensive for society that banks have more equity. The only reason that that equity is expensive for banks is, first of all, viewed from the current owners and managers of the banks, it's expensive because increasing it is bearing more downside risk than otherwise borne by others. That's a pure debt overhang effect. Beyond that, you lose the subsidies if you reduce your indebtedness. That's no fun for somebody who gets subsidies. I understand that. So I am not blaming people for following their own incentives and competing fairly in this market and doing all they can. The problem is that we need to counter that. We need to counter the incentive to always borrow and borrow and borrow and avoid equity because it is expensive from the bank's perspective. Here come the regulators and people who are going to protect the public because it's the public that's harmed when banks borrow too much. So, so the good news then is that we can change it, and we mostly need to understand what to do and to do it. That's a little bit where the bad news is going to start coming in. And so that's where I'm going to soon stop. Now, the banks would have you believe that, equity levels have really strengthened since the crisis. We tripled the capital requirements. Everything is good now. All of that. Fortress balance sheets. Martin Wolf probably had the best line about tripling the equity requirements. His line was, tripling it sounds tough until you realize that tripling almost nothing doesn't get you very far. So it was almost nothing, and tripling it didn't get you very far. And that tripling is equity relative to so-called risk-weighted assets, a whole other can of worms. So in the bad news, there'll be the flawed structure of the regulation, the flawed incentives, it gives the complexity of the regulation, all this other stuff. Martin will talk about that. So you say, well, you want a lot of equity. How much? You go back to before safety nets. Is equity scarce and expensive? Not in the rest of the economy, it's not. Any business that has something to offer that's viable can raise equity at appropriate prices. The banks might not like the prices they get today, partly because these prices are lower than their book value, the numbers that they put on. Well, it's possible the book values are a bit too high, maybe. Maybe the market knows what it's really worth, even with the subsidies, maybe less than the bankers would like. But that's just tough. That's not relevant to this debate. What's relevant is that when you raise equity, you have more equity to spend and to lend and to back up your liabilities. So therefore, more equity is good. So what to do? Well, we have immediate prescriptions. Immediate, because the epigraph for the chapter, if not now, when, is time plays a trick of getting rotten before it gets ripe. So they always say not now, not now. And we say, yes, now, right now, precisely now. If there are banks that are sick, we say, recognize that, face that, in Spain, everywhere, in the London's banks, maybe city. Without subsidies, is it viable? Is it a zombie bank or not? Figure that out. What do they really have on their books? If they're sick, it's good to know that now and not in a crisis. Better now. There are ways to deal with it at times like this. So recognize the non-viable banks. And those that are viable can raise equity. In fact, if you're not sure, tell them all to raise equity. And those that can't, you might flag for examination about what's going on. Why is it that they can't? Are they too opaque? Are they too untouchable? What's going on? So recognize who's weak and then do something about them. And those that are viable, raise their equity immediately. First and foremost, easy, hold the payouts. The equity is there. Most companies in the economy retain their earnings first and foremost to get money to lend. No problem to invest. Berkshire Hathaway, to take one example, never pays dividend, never. Warren Buffett likes his investors to just trust him with the money, and they do. Apple didn't pay dividends for a long, long time. This returning capital is not essential in the economy. If you do something good with it, your shareholders will be happy, especially if you're a publicly traded company, no problem. So retaining earnings, easy fix. Don't let them out. It's already there. Do something, anything but deplete it. Raise more equity. All these things are doable right now. No new laws are required. So we can have a better system, and we can start now. That's basically what we're saying. So why aren't we doing it? Well, we have a system, we have time it takes to change it, we have decision makers, we have politics. I finished with the good news, and now Martin can go back to reality. Thank you.
I would also very much like to thank the organizers, in particular Adam and Simon, and for organizing this event for the launch of our book. I would also like to thank the three commentators for, well, first of all, having read the book, I assume, and and providing us with their comments. And then I'd like to thank all of you for your interest in this topic. I would like to continue right where Anat left off. Why did we actually write this book, and why equity? I'm normally not a sort of gung-ho regulation person, but I think that in this case we actually have a need for regulation. I also think that equity regulation would improve liability. One thing that's been missing in the crisis has been liability of the sort that a dyed-in-the-wool market economist would wish to have, and that it would take the burden off some of the attempts, the other attempts that we have to interfere with what banks are actually doing. Why this book? It's an attempt to bring the discussion about banking regulation out of the circle of specialists and into a more general audience. We've observed that in the discussion of insiders, there are many statements that are proposed that don't make much sense to us, and there's a lot that wouldn't really be said the way it is if there was more transparency about this. Why do we not observe very much reform? One aspect of this is international negotiation, international coordination. She asked me about Basel. It's a way to get to the lowest common denominator. And I'm the first to admit that my own country, together with France, has been a major culprit in this. If you take the recent decisions at the Basel Committee on the liquidity coverage ratio, well, negotiations about that go under the heading anything but cash. We should really replace the LCR abbreviation by ABC. We know that cash is liquid, but cash doesn't get any returns. So we need to add something that earns returns in order to make the regulation less tough. Just as in the previous era, we added hybrid debt and called it equity. So first it's government bonds. We know that Greek bonds are always liquid. Then it's covered bonds. And then when Mr. Diamond complains that mortgage-backed securities in the US are at least as liquid as covered bonds in Denmark, mortgage-backed securities have been added to the assets that are being counted against the liquidity coverage ratio. We've known that mortgage-backed securities are completely reliable at providing liquidity. But I'm talking about capital. In some of Europe, including, of course, Germany, low capital ratios, low capital is not seen as a concern. Governments seem to be more concerned about making sure that banks do not have to have very much capital than the reverse. Why? Many politicians think of banks primarily as a source of money. So if a bank has a given amount of equity and you ask them to fund a little bit more, and they say, oh, but we are constrained by the equity we have, then that's not such so nice for the person who wants the money. If you take a public bank, like a savings bank in Germany or a Landesbank, of course the owners don't really want to be putting money in. And the owners are part of the political establishment and part of the negotiating team in Basel. Not in person, but you have this representation. Then there always is this argument about level playing fields and the competitiveness of our banks. National champions must be promoted. So in the name of promoting national champions and in the name of allowing the Landesbanken a field for gambling for survival in a constellation with enormous excess capacity in the market and hardly any margins, the German regulator allowed them to have all these structured investment vehicles with enormous commitments to these vehicles, off balance sheet, investing in the triple-digit billion amounts in toxic securities. Well, it's the kind of competitive success, funding by asset-backed commercial paper from American money market funds and investing in toxic securities that I, as a German taxpayer, could really do without. In the case of Westdeutsche Landesbank, the losses since 2001, costs to the taxpayer since 2001, amount to something like 22 billion euros. At 2% interest per year, that gives you the University of Bonn without the medical center. And it would be lots of schools. Except when I say this, well, I'm politically incorrect. For one of the politicians relying on this kind of money as a way of funding expenditures they want to be funded without control, the power to do so is worth every euro of taxpayer money. That's one reason why negotiations in Basel went the way they did. Let's think a bit more about competitiveness, because that's a theme that resonates also in the American political arena. When Jamie Dimon says Basel III is anti-American, that makes headlines. As a person who has a past in competition policy, I've heard this on lots of occasions. We must promote our national champions. Which meant, for instance, that Deutsche Post needs a monopoly in letters in order to charge a lot on letters domestically in order to subsidize DHL services in the US. There is no national interest in the competitive success of any one firm or any one industry. The real problem for our economies is to make sure that the resources we have available are placed into those activities where they're most productive. And there is no assurance that those physicists and mathematicians who compute risk models in banks are better employed in the banks than they would be, say, in developing technologies, improving technologies for e-mobility or improving technology for storing electricity as we are expanding on renewable energies. Now, I don't know where they would be most profitably employed. Normally we say it's the market system that does that. I mean, Mr. Ackermann or Mr. Dimon don't know this either. We leave it to the market. But then the market is distorted because having subsidies, bailouts, guarantees, having tax savings on debt introduces biases. Having externalities, systemic risk that's imposed on others, is a kind of pollution. What would we think of the export successes of a chemical company that owes these successes in part to its not needing to clean up the waste that it dumps in the river. And having lived in the city of Basel for 9 years, shortly after the huge incident in Schweizer Halle in '86, I know what I'm talking about. So here we are all together in a strange field of activities, a strange field of arguments, and it's important to debunk the competitiveness, the level playing field myth. Back to Basel III. Deutsche Bank, at this point, by the standards of Basel III, has 14% equity. Maybe not at this point, but as of last annual report. 14%. Wonderful. But that's 2% of total assets. If the leverage ratio regulation comes in, it'll go up to 3%. 3% is what Lehman Brothers showed before they went under. These are small numbers. This is where Martin Wolf comes in. The US, of course, for commercial banks, has always insisted on a leverage ratio. Europeans complain that the US has not implemented Basel II, which allows for the risk weighting. When you talk about this with people in the regulatory community or people in the industry, you hear, oh, but without risk weighting, you get regulatory arbitrage. People will invest in assets that are the most risky, given that risk weights are the same for all of them. Well, with risk weighting, you get regulatory arbitrage as well. The risk weighting is inappropriate, and people will invest in assets that have high risks and low risk weights. And the experience of the past 15 years shows that they are able to use this system in order to economize on equity, as it is called. The ratio between risk-weighted assets and total assets has been going down constantly. So why are the risk weights inappropriate? Well, they come from a mixture of make-believe science, politics, and tradition. Sovereign debt has a zero risk weight. We all know that Greek sovereign bonds are riskless. There is an assumption of independence of credit risks. We all know that mortgage loans are stochastically independent, and default risk on those loans is not correlated. See our experience with subprime. Interest rate risk, the risk that interest rates might go up and you might have problems because risks on loans, the interest rate on loans that you made is fixed, is not taken into account for loans in the bank book. That was the risk that killed the S&Ls in the early 80s. So 3 of the major risks that have been responsible for major catastrophes are not considered in the risk weighting system that we have in Basel. UBS, Dexia, Hypo Real Estate, all were insolvent from stuff that had zero risk weight. Risk weighting is also responsible for interconnectedness. A lot of this credit default swap business had to do with banks trying to get credit risks off their books. That's why AIG had these 500 billion worth of credit default swaps. So the only problem was, without the US taxpayer, the counterparty credit risk on those credit default swaps would have come right back and hit the institutions that thought they were insured. The risk weighting system promotes interconnectedness and therefore promotes systemic interdependence. It also promotes intransparency about where the systemic risks actually are. As Anat was saying, we're going for a very high requirement. 20% to 30% of total assets. that's not based on any rocket science, but on judgment. We think it's better, the judgment is better than the mixture of make-believe science, politics, and tradition that we've been using so far. These numbers are in the order of magnitude that banks have had before the government stepped in and provided support, i.e. before World War I. At these numbers, the systemic repercussions of deleveraging after losses and the systemic repercussions on loss of confidence in interbank markets would be significantly less dangerous. Finally, how fast? Today, Larry Summers had an article in the Washington Post concerning Fannie and Freddie and the involvement of the US in housing markets. He wrote, "All this must be reformed, but now is not the time." If you ask Stefan Ingves of the Swedish Riksbank, and if you ask researchers at the World Bank who have looked into these things, it's always better to intervene right away, clean the mess up, and then move on, rather than let the problems smolder and have the system depressed. One of the biggest worries I have right now about where we are is that we haven't cleaned up the mess and that we may still have some time bombs waiting to go off, or alternatively, that the depressed state of the distressed state of many important institutions will prevent them from funding going forward.